Hello everyone, this is Professor Akbar, and today in this video we will be talking about adding and subtracting integers. In our book with Martin in Gray book, this is the section 8.3 and 8.4. If you've already watched the video, you will notice that the method that I'm talking about here is a little bit different than the method the book explains. However, both are valid and you can decide whichever one you would like to work with. With the method that I'm about to explain, I feel there's a little bit less manipulation, so it comes in a little bit easier. It does require a little bit of practice, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. I have a little chart just explaining what's going on. In terms of adding integers, when you are adding two positive numbers, obviously you're going to be adding them. And for the sign of the final answer, you should be putting the sign of either one of those or the positive. When we are talking about two negative numbers, we should still, because they're the same signs, we're still adding them. However, the sign in the final answer is also going to be the same sign, which is the sign of negative. So the way I summarize this is by thinking in my head is same sign add. Same signs add, and the acronym that I'm using for that is SSA, just to kind of keep this in my head. The second part is when you're adding or subtracting, however you want to think of it, to opposite signs. So if I'm adding a positive number with a negative number, they're opposite. You technically subtract the absolute values of your numbers. And then for the final answer, you stick the sign of the number, whoever's absolute value is larger. Same goes true if I have a negative and a positive. And I'm going to explain that with the numbers so that way it makes more sense. So the way I remember this is opposite signs subtract. So if you have two opposite signs, you're going to go ahead and subtract them, and the acronym we have down for that is OSS. Now, let's take a look at the rules on how to actually work with this. So when you get a problem to add or subtract signed integers, the first thing is to decide whether you should be adding or subtracting. And this is where the acronyms that we just decided on, or the chart that comes in handy. If I am given two numbers with the same sign, I'm going to be adding their absolute values. But if I'm given two numbers with opposite signs, I'm going to be subtracting their absolute values. And remember, when you subtract, you always subtract the bigger number, you subtract the smaller number away from the bigger number. Then once you decide, number two is to actually perform the addition or subtraction. And lastly, you put the sign for the answer, and you always put the sign of the absolute of the number that is whose absolute value is the bigger. So let's take a look at that. The first example we have is plus 2 and plus 4. The first thing I'm going to do is come back on here, and I'm going to think through and think, should I be actually adding my numbers or should I be actually subtracting my numbers here? Because both the numbers have the same signs, I know that that tells me same sign adds. So what I'm going to do is actually come in here without worrying about the signs itself. You're going to go ahead and add up the absolute values, which gives you the 6. Now, this was the second step where you actually carried out the addition and subtraction. The last step is to figure out the sign of your answer. There's two ways of going about it. If I started off with two of the same signs, regardless, your answer is going to be the same sign. However, the other thing you could do is think about it properly, which is to look at the sign of the absolute, the number whose absolute value is bigger. So if I look at the 2 and I look at the 4, because you're looking at just the absolute value, 4 is the bigger one. So whatever the sign for the 4 is will be the final sign for your answer, in this case, which would be the positive 6. Now let's look at another example. You're talking about a negative 2 minus a 4. First thing we need to decide is, should you add or should you subtract the given numbers? Because you have same signs for your number. And one of the things, if you notice, the examples I'm giving you here, each number has to have just the same one sign, because we want to make our life simples, and we want to make sure that each number only has one sign before we start getting to the step of adding and subtracting. If that's not a case, then I would recommend getting it down to that case so you can actually work it out this way. Your numbers both have same sign. Because they have same sign, you're going to go ahead and add them based on our chart, and based on the absolute values, you get them added and you get the sign of a 6. Okay, now let's talk about what will be the sign for your final answer. So if you think about it, our step is to look at the absolute value of the given numbers. In this case, the given addends. Looking at the absolute value, 4 is the bigger one, and 4 has the sign of negative, so that's what ends up being the sign of your final answer, and your answer comes out to be a -6 here. Let's apply the rule to something when we don't have same sign. When you have a +2 minus a 4, you have two opposite signs. We need to find out what we do, whether we add it or subtract it. So what we do know is opposite signs subtract, OSS. And in this case, we know we have the opposite sign subtract. Now remember this, when you're actually doing the act of addition or act of subtraction, you are working with the absolute values of the numbers, and for subtraction, you gotta take the smaller number away from the bigger number. So the absolute value of the bigger number, absolute value of the smaller number, and you're subtracting the two things, and when you subtract it, you end up with a 2. That's what your number part of your answer is. Let's see what the sign part of the answer is going to be. Remember, you got to look at the absolute values, and if looking at the absolute value, the 4 comes out to be the bigger one, or the larger value, and you keep the sign for that 4, which happens to be a negative. And that's how you end up with a -2. If you like to think of it on a number line, this is what you're doing. You have a 1 and a 2, a 1 and a 2, 0, you have a -1, -2, -3, and a -4. So what you have is you start from the origin and you move, and I'm going to do this with a different color pen. You move here, you get to the +2, and then you're taking away 4. So you're going to the left 4, and in that case, when you're going to the left 4, you go 1, you go 2, you go 3, and you go 4, and you end up at a -2. So if you like, for the simple problems, you can always check your thinking with the number line, and it does help to see what's happening. Now, let's look at the last example. We have a -2 plus a 4. Once again, the first thing we need to decide is, should you add your numbers or should you subtract? Remember, we have two opposite signs, and opposite signs subtract. So we're going to go ahead and write that down, and we are going to go ahead and subtract the absolute values. Remember, we're subtracting or adding the absolute values because we're working with the signs separately. So the absolute value, the bigger number, the absolute value, the smaller number, you subtract them, and once you subtract them, you end up with a 2. So 2 is your magnitude. Let's figure out the sign. Remember, to figure out the sign, we look at the numbers, the absolute values, and figure out who's the bigger one and keep the sign of the bigger one. And in this case, the bigger one is the 4, so you keep the sign of that, leaving you with an answer of +2 for the final answer. Okay, let's take a look at an example where we may or may not have something which is as nice as a number with a simple one sign. And if that's the case, how do we go about it? Hypothetically saying, let's say we have a -2 minus a +8. The very first thing my recommendation is to do is make sure that each number has one sign. We're going to go ahead and clean up these signs. How do we think about cleaning it up? There are multiple ways of cleaning it up. The way we think about it is back to our chart, which says positive gives me a positive, a negative gives me a positive, and two opposite signs in any format gives you a negative. And if you're looking at that chart, this two positive, negative technically are getting multiplied because there's a parenthesis in between, there's a sign right before and a sign right after. So the two opposite signs combine down to a negative, and then the -2 copies down exactly the way it is to begin with. At this point, when you have two numbers with two signs, meaning each number only has one sign, we can decide should you add or should you subtract. And remember, with our rule, we need to remember we have same sign add. So what that means is you're going to ignore your signs for time being and just take the absolute values and add them. And when you go ahead and do that, the magnitude or the number comes out to be to be a simple 10. That's just the adding part. And for the sign part, you look at the absolute value of the bigger number and you stick the sign for that, which leaves you with a -10 for your final answer. Please continue working with your problems, practice a few, and thank you for watching.